Right. Next up, we have writing in APA style. And I think a lot of people, in my experience, neglect covering this, especially in undergrad. And I think it makes a big difference both in reading and writing to really understand the philosophy behind writing in APA style. Some overview of the style, of course, is citations, which is the part that everybody talks about, right? Then there is the use of past tense, the use of active voice, and bias-free language. So in-text citation. So first off, any information that the reader would not be expected to know, and again, we're talking a non-specialist reader, not necessarily somebody with a similar background to you, should be cited. The United States as a large country would not necessarily need to be cited, but for example, the definition of universal attribution bias, that would need to be cited. Even information that you know that you're not necessarily thinking of initially as being from a source should be cited. You would need to actually find a source that gives meaningful evidence in order to cite that something is true. For example, definitions is a big one, right? I mentioned universal attribution error, or universal attribution bias, more accurately known as correspondence bias. Instead of just trying to recite the definition from memory, it is far better to find a source, cite the definition from that source, and give evidence of the effect. So there are two ways to go about in-text citation. The first one is narrative citation. So that is as part of your sentence. You're already, referring to the paper, the authors, and then you just include the year as part of the citation. And then there's parenthetical citation. So that is you state a fact, and then in parentheses you put the information for the citation. And there are different reasons to use both. Narrative citation is probably more often in line with APA's philosophy and goals, but parenthetical citation actually often saves a lot of time because you're spending less time focusing on these specific findings or the specific authors, so you can put more information in a single sentence with multiple citations. So some example citations are here on the screen. One author, two authors is pretty self-explanatory. For three or more authors, we now no longer actually refer to any more than the first author. We refer to the first author and then et al, meaning and others, with the full list being in the references section. And there's also the example of an organization or an organization author that is being abbreviated. So all of this information is in the APA manual as well as on online resources. Now when you're using direct quotations, the biggest difference is that you want to include the page number. So you have the full quotation, you don't end the sentence yet because you need to then cite it. You include the author and the year, just like with the typical citation, and then you add the page number. That said, direct quotations are usually pretty rare in APA style, almost exclusively limited to definitions in my experience, because it is always preferred to use your own words. That way you're forced to kind of use your own analysis of the source and decide what is important. That said, you can make some changes to direct quotations if needed. So for example, if you need to change the language, then you can, if I'm going to be discussing bias-free language later, if you need to make a correction for that, or say, for example, they use a pronoun, like they say they, because the sentence before they said the participants. You could say open bracket, the participants, close bracket, and then the rest of the sentence. You can also skip text if needed. A direct quotation is often, for the purpose of the original author, not necessarily for the purposes you're using. So you may need to skip some or multiple or even entire sentences for your direct quotation. So APA style uses the author date system, as many scientific formats do. And this is especially important to know because it contrasts with what you've probably learned before. Often you will, what is most common in high schools and early undergraduate is using MLA, Modern Language Association format. And of course, most of your textbooks are probably going to be using Chicago format. So these do not use the author date format, but APA does. And this is specifically in order to draw attention to the progress between publications. So if you're citing one source from 1958, another source from 1970, another from 1989, another from 2000, and another from 2020, you would expect that to be a progression of findings, right? There'd be more recent findings, would be, have more sophisticated results or results that they had not yet found, at least in 1950 and so forth. This is also why when you're writing your literature review, APA uses past tense, which again is a contrast to MLA in Chicago, or specifically MLA, in which they often use present tense. Right? If you've written an essay in your English class, you probably say so-and-so says this. In APA, we do not do that because we want to be very clear what has happened in the past. However, while I compare APA style to MLA, specifically focusing on past tense, I do want to note that not everything is past tense. Rather, you use your actual judgment based on when it has happened or is happening. So if you're referring to an ongoing or a future event, you still use the appropriate tense. For example, I might say that Zhejiang found, past tense, that when people are, so that's present tense, repeatedly exposed to the same stimulus, they develop, I guess develop is still present tense, right? They develop a more positive attitude. So there's a mixture of past and present tense there because I'm referring to a finding that happened in the past versus an ongoing effect. Similar to the past tense, we also use the active voice. So what is the active voice? The active voice is saying that if you are familiar with the subject and the object of a sentence, the subject should be presented first, and then they act on the object. So we say the research assistant conducted interviews, the subject of the sentence being the research assistant, the interviews being the object. If I say interviews were conducted by the research assistant, that is passive voice. That is because the entity that is controlling the sentence, that is given the power, is the object, the interviews, rather than the person who is conducting it. So APA, we mentioned the importance of citations because giving credit is important. So part of that giving that credit is active voice. As I mentioned, you want to give credit to the research assistant. However, if I were to just say interviews were conducted, that's passive voice and it might deny the research assistant credit. One way that many people use to test whether a sentence is an active voice or passive voice is the zombie rule. So what is the zombie rule? The zombie rule is saying if you can take the action in the sentence and then end with by zombies, the sentence is in the passive voice. The research assistant conducted interviews. you cannot add by zombies to that for it to make sense. Whereas if I say interviews were conducted by zombies, that makes sense. So in that case, you can clearly see one is in the active voice and the other is on the passive voice. Another part of using the active voice is that, yes, you can use first-person pronouns. Obviously, it needs to be accurate. It needs to be meaningful for the sentence. But you might say, I hypothesized X, or I conducted interviews with participants. So you give yourself credit as well. The final part of this video is bias-free writing. Now, bias-free writing is basically a goal of APA, right? APA is psychologists, and we know how bias can be harmful. Part of bias-free writing, now you can look at the rest of the slide, is looking at how identity plays a role in things. So here I've asked a series of questions on the slide. Which will get more attention, research by a professor or research by a graduate student? Research by a well-known superstar, so a Roy Baumeister or an Albert Bandura, or an early career researcher, somebody who just got their PhD. Research by a man or research by a woman. This one less so now, but definitely was a major one. And the extent to which it's still true, I do not know. I would have to read the empirical research. Research by a researcher named Joseph or by a researcher named Jaquan. So as you can see with those examples, sometimes a message has a risk of being ignored because they would rather judge the person who wrote it. So because of that, APA prefers to obscure identity features and take an identity blind approach whenever possible when referring to people who are cited. For this reason, we generally only use the last name, as you saw earlier on when I talked about citations. And you might use the first and middle initial if you really have to, if there's multiple authors with the same last name. And then the first name really only if there's multiple with the same initial. There's very few exceptions, such as if you're really writing effectively a biography of somebody's work using a literature review. But 90% of the time, you would only use somebody's last name. So this means that you do not use their titles, you do not use their degrees, you do not use their ranks if they have a rank of some sort. You just use their last name, and that is everything. So this is intended to avoid the question of, looking at, this person cited a lot of, graduate student researchers. Maybe their work is lower quality. If it went through peer review, it went through peer review. That's the important part. However, there's also other parts to bias-free writing. So, for example, sometimes you have to discuss identity. So what are some ways to go about that? Well, first off is being very clear on the difference between adjectives and nouns. So this is something you will really see if you compare older writing to more modern writing. Using adjectives in place of nouns can be dehumanizing and just kind of make someone seem less empowered, essentially. Even the difference between subject and participant, although that is not the same thing, is to avoid dehumanizing. But for example, we might have men and women, or I should say women and men, instead of just saying females and males. But however, we might say female participants and male participants. In terms of my self-correction a moment ago, generally in bias-free writing, you try not to favor the historically powerful group. Although this can be tricky. So let's look at an example. So the historical way of describing the information on the screen would be that you would actually probably say subjects, but participants were 40% men, 50% women, and 10% other. Now, if you so obviously you're empowering the men there. Generally, actually, in psychology, generally women are more common as participants. You would say participants were 50% women, 40% men, 10% other. However, if men are more common, then the actual bias-free answer is a little bit more up in the air. Would you then say 10% other, 40% women, and 50% men? I don't know if there's really a good answer to that. It's just something you want to keep in mind. And the final part of writing in APA style is writing the abstract. So here is an example of an abstract. You don't need to read this whole thing. I'm going to walk through it. So remember, the abstract is the part before the introduction and summarizes the paper. So we have the first sentence, and it's basically describing what your topic is. So there should be basically, drawing someone's eye. This is what the topic is, maybe a little bit of information about why it matters. Then you state the problem that you tackle. So think about it. You went from the very beginning of the introduction section to later on in the introduction section, right? You're stating, okay, this is a problem that needs to be addressed. Then you move on to why this problem matters. So this is less common in a student paper, but especially in a professional academic paper, you would want to include information about this. Either way, it's a good idea in student papers as well. Why does your research question matter? Next, now we're kind of moving on to the method. We have what are our variables. This is kind of a really general idea, so it doesn't actually state a hypothesis, but you might specifically say here, I hypothesized that X causes Y. That might be how you handle the research question. Then you want to describe how you went about the research, so you're describing your methods and maybe your results, kind of condensing them together with each other. And then left is the key impact of the research. So this is kind of taken from the discussion. Why does your research matter? And that is it for the abstract. So once you follow those 6 steps, you'll generally have a pretty solid abstract. And that is the end of this section.